Welcome everyone to the inaugural episode of the Planet Pantry podcast. In this podcast, we're going to be exploring the ingredients that make the cuisines of the world tick. The things in people's pantries, fridges, and freezers that they reach for every day to make their favorite foods. My name's Nick, and I'll be your guide as we explore the history, science, culture, and of course uses for these amazing products, and hopefully we can all learn something together. This week, we're starting with a big one: mold-based soy ferments. Now, that's a mouthful and it might not sound super sexy, but trust me, this is one of the most important groups of ingredients on Earth.
In fact, it's such a broad topic that we're going to be focusing mostly just on soy sauce and its ancient predecessors.
And in this episode, we're going back to the beginnings of these products by exploring their history in ancient China. Next week, we'll follow them as they hitch a ride with Buddhism across Asia. And finally, on week 3, we'll explore the state of things like soy sauce and miso today. So without further ado, let's get into it.
So yeah, mold-based soybean ferments might not sound like the most sexy and interesting topic to start off a podcast with, but they are some of the most ubiquitous products in the world, and they include the likes of soy sauce, tamari, and miso. Some of the most used condiments in Asia, and since the 1970s, some of the most used condiments in the West as well. And they have an amazing history that goes back over 2,000 years into ancient China. It involves mythology, dynasties, traveling Buddhist monks, and many other condiments along the way, and many other cultural points of significance along the way that we're going to explore over the next 3 weeks. But to start, I think it's important to get a brief description out of the way of what makes all of this possible, because although we're basically tracking soy sauce and miso that we're all familiar with around the world, and going back to some still related but very different condiments from ancient China, they all still have the same basic process that is facilitated by a mold called Aspergillus oryzae, which I learned today is actually pronounced Aspergillus oryzae. But I'm not going to say it like that because I've been saying Aspergillus oryzae for a long time, and I'd be stumbling all over myself if I tried. That said, this is an ingredient that deserves as much respect as anything else in the culinary world. We're all familiar with sort of the Columbian Exchange and how a lot of ingredients got moved between the Americas and Europe and Asia over the past 500-ish years. And as world-changing as that exchange of ingredients has been, there's been an underlying exchange of techniques as well. And when it comes to the value of these techniques, I think there's a very strong argument for the growing of koji and the use of koji, or of this mold Aspergillus oryzae more specifically, as one of the most important techniques that has moved around the world over the past few hundred years. And we're just going to briefly go over how it works, the technique, and the biology behind it. Culturally, at least in terms of the sort of fermentation renaissance of the past couple of decades, koji sort of goes hand in hand with fermentation. And although most of these products are the result of some level of fermentation, the magic of koji and the magic of Aspergillus oryzae is separate from fermentation. It's more of an enzymatic process. When we grow koji, we're looking to take advantage of one of the 3 enzymes that the mold produces, which are protease, lipase, and amylase. Protease breaks complex proteins down into the constituent amino acids, and the amino acids that are produced when koji is applied to the proteins of things like soybeans or grains are not only extremely good for you, but also the foundation of the fabled umami flavor. And that's where, soy sauce and miso get the majority of their distinct taste that we hold them in such high regard for. Next up is amylase, which is another enzyme which breaks starches down into simple sugars, which can easily be digested or fermented. This enzyme is less prized in the production of things like soy sauce and miso than it is in things like rice wine or amazake. And finally, we have lipase, which breaks fats down into fatty acids, which isn't necessarily something that a lot of people want to do as much as they want to take advantage of amylase and protease, but there are some niche applications for this enzyme as well. And although we talk about Aspergillus oryzae or koji as sort of a singular thing, there are actually thousands of different strains of molds that can be used for roughly these applications, all of which have been selectively bred over many generations to put more of an emphasis on one of these enzymes. So for example, if you're making something like a miso or a soy sauce, you would use one that favors protease, so you can get more of those amino acids and therefore more umami flavor. Whereas if you're making something like rice wine or amazake and you want that sweetness or some sugars to ferment into alcohol, you would favor amylase. This stuff is no joke in Japan, and just as if you walk into a home brewing shop here in the States and you see all the varieties of yeasts or hops or anything like that, there is even more of a selection of types of koji spores available to home koji growers. In 1958, a survey found that foods produced with koji generated $1 billion for Japan, which gave them $500 million in taxes that year, which at the time was 20% of Japan's national budget, which is insane. And even as Japan became one of the world's foremost technology hubs and its economy just exploded, even in the 1970s, as these koji-based products began to make their way into the popular markets in the West, they still accounted for 1.5% of Japan's gross national product. Those are very big numbers for what is effectively a set of condiments and a few beverages. But these condiments and beverages and their relatives and ancestors from China and Korea and the rest of Asia really are the foundations, or at least a very important part of the foundations for some of the most important cuisines in the world. So the question is, where did they all come from? It's kind of hard to imagine when you first learn how miso is made. And to quickly go over how that's done, you grow Aspergillus oryzae, you grow some of this mold on usually rice or barley, and then you mix it with some cooked mashed soybeans and then a lot of salt, about 15% by weight or maybe a little less. Then you let it ferment for about 3 months to a year, maybe more, maybe less, depending on the flavors that you're looking to get out of the final product. But how did anybody ever figure this out? It sounds crazy. And when you first learn about this stuff, you sort of picture a guy somewhere in Japan at some point just finding this tray of rice that he probably left out from a couple of nights ago. It's covered in mold, and he decides, oh, you know what, I'm going to mix this with some cooked soybeans and a bunch of salt. And then a year later, he decides to taste it, and it's amazing, and shares it with the world, and a revolution begins. But that would be the behavior of a crazy person today, and it also would have been the behavior of a crazy person in medieval Japan when this stuff first started to emerge as we know it today. And that's because the answer to this question is that miso and shoyu, or Japanese soy sauce, stand on the shoulders of generations and thousands of years of innovation which took part across Asia. And the true origins of this story begin way before anything resembling miso existed. You have to go back beyond ancient history, and you have to start in a time where the universe was contained within an egg, and there was nothing but opposing energies. The energies of yin and yang would eventually find balance against each other, and Pangu would emerge from this egg. And Pangu is the key creation character in many Chinese mythologies. And after emerging from the egg, Pangu would set about the business of separating the earth from the heavens. And he did this by standing between them for 18,000 years. And once this awesome task was complete, Pangu died and became everything that we can see from the earth today. He became the sun and the moon, the mountains, the oceans, the rivers, everything. And he was followed by Nuwa and Fuxi. Nuwa and Fuxi were initially separate people who would eventually come to be married and set the foundations for Chinese civilization. Nuwa created the first people, and Fuxi gave them a lot of the first tools that they would need to start a civilization, including the basis for a writing system, the Chinese patriarchal system, and some agricultural tools. Now, at this point, I think it's kind of interesting to go off on a bit of an aside here and explore the concept of civilization as a whole, because growing up in the West, between the United States and Canada, I was always taught that civilization began in the Fertile Crescent, between the Tigris and Euphrates River and along the Nile. And although it was never said like this directly, the narrative always kind of implied that civilization as a concept was exported from this region to the rest of the world. But the reality of it is that civilization is now understood to have been discovered independently in at least 5 places around the world, including the Fertile Crescent, where the oldest known civilizations began in around 10,000 BC, but also the Indo-Gangetic Plain of India, the Mesoamerican Gulf of what is now the Gulf of Mexico, the Andean coast, and northern China. So I think that an understanding of this, that civilization didn't just come from one place but developed independently over thousands of years before many of them came into contact with each other, is important in understanding and appreciating how the world as we know it came to be. Each of these civilizations accomplished many incredible feats before we came together as sort of a more global world, and they all contributed something to the global culture that we know. But coming back to the foundations of the world as the Chinese knew it in 7000 BCE, we follow up the lives of Nuwa and Fuxi, who lived for 18,000 years, with the life of my absolute favorite character in Chinese mythology, Shennong. Shennong is regarded as sort of the god farmer of Chinese mythology. He lived for 45,000 years and created the foundations for traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM, which is still practiced widely today. He did this by going around and tasting every herb, flower, mushroom, plant, whatever that he could find, and creating tonics and recording the results. He did eventually die from tasting a poisonous herb and not being able to get to the antidote in time. But, that's the entire point of his life. We learn from his mistakes. And before his passing, he also endowed the ancient Chinese with a lot of important agricultural knowledge, including things like animal husbandry and the cultivation of some key crops. Shennong named 5 key crops that would become the foundation for Chinese civilization, and they were millet, adzuki bean, rice, barley or wheat, depending on the account, and soybeans. Soybeans are an incredibly versatile crop, even today. Today we use them in fuels and materials, animal feed. They're also just an incredible source of nutrition, and when you add koji to them, or Aspergillus oryzae, you get even more nutrition and types of nutrition that are harder to get from our regular diets, as well as some amazing umami flavor. They also have the benefit of being able to be rotated against grass crops like wheat or barley, so when they're out of season, you can grow soybeans, and you have a year-round growing season, and that's great for the health of the soil. And although today the biggest producers of soybeans are by far Brazil and the United States, China's been growing these wonderful beans since at least 10,000 BCE, and I like to think that that's at least in part thanks to the hard work and sacrifice of the great farmer god Shennong. I think that now is a good time to step back and mention really quick that Chinese mythology, like any mythology, is really hard to pin down. It's a lot of stories passed through many generations, and it's hard to get a consistent telling of all of these stories. There are a lot of different versions, there are a lot of different tellings, and what I'm citing here is mostly second-hand accounts of Sima Qian, who is a historian of the early Han Dynasty, as well as the Bamboo Annals, which is a very famous Chinese history and mythology book. So if you want to better understand this history and this mythology, which I recommend you do, follow up on it yourself. There are a lot of different accounts and versions of these stories across Asia, so dive deep. Following the rule of Shennong, which lasted 45,000 years by many accounts, we had the rule of the 5 mythological emperors, all of whom served a variety of purposes, and we're getting to the point now where mythology meets reality. And that's an interesting aspect of Chinese history, is that because we measure Chinese history in terms of dynasties, and the emperors of all of these dynasties are said to have the mandate of heaven, which says that the gods have chosen you and your lineage to rule over China. And that rich and fascinating history begins, naturally, when the mythological characters of Chinese history, and specifically the final of the 5 mythological emperors, Emperor Shun, picks a mere mortal human to hand over the rule of the Middle Kingdom to. And of course, this chosen emperor would have to be someone incredibly special, and they were. Emperor Yu, who would become the only ruler in Chinese history to obtain the title the Great. And great he was because he solved one of the greatest problems of early northern Chinese civilization: flooding along the Yellow River. Over the entire period of the 5 mythological emperors, many people had tried and failed to solve this problem, and Yu finally came through, dedicating his entire life to it, ignoring family and anything outside of his task to complete it. And it was because of that that he was handed the title of first emperor of the Jia dynasty. Now, the first records of writing in China come from the Shang dynasty, the dynasty after the Jia. And it was because of this that for a long time, historians thought that the Jia dynasty never actually existed. It's so shrouded in legend and mythology that it was just thought to be a continuation of this specific mythology. And it's only been over the past few decades that enough evidence has been gathered and enough consensus has been gathered to accept that the Jia dynasty was just as real as its only slightly less legendary Shang and Zhou successors. Over the next few thousand years, Chinese culture grew to be one of the richest and most fascinating cultures in human history. It's important to remember as well how big of a country China is, how much of a landmass it occupies. It is really a continent-sized country, not only in size but also population. And that size and that diversity of climate that comes along with it led to one of the most diverse and interesting culinary cultures in the world. Chinese food is famously incredibly intimidating to Western chefs and cooks because it's so vast and so developed and so technical, and incorporates so many different techniques and foods that seem so separate because you really have to look at China in terms of its different provinces when it comes to its food. It's not really fair to compare something like French food to something like Chinese food because these are two totally separate culinary cultures which developed totally independently and with totally different resources over such a long period of time before ever coming into contact with each other. But one thing that I always find absolutely fascinating is that in all of the corners of the world in which civilization developed independently, we not only decided to start cooking our food to make it easier for us to eat, but we also decided to make it delicious and to use what we had around us to make our food exciting and something that we could look forward to every day and something that we could celebrate our favorite occasions with. And over the next few thousand years, as dynasties rose and fell and wars were waged, and food was developed not only for enjoyment, but also to feed troops on the front of the battle line, to feed farmers in the fields, and also in the most efficient way possible. And one product that sort of sits in the middle of those extremes of practicality and enjoyability are ancient Chinese jiangs. It's pretty easy to trace the etymology of the word jiang to some things that we still have today and which are actually growing in popularity today, like gochujang and doenjang from Korea. But these ancient sauces and pastes, usually fermented, began to be produced in China many thousands of years ago. And at that time, they were mostly made out of proteins, mostly fish in the beginning, and a lot of different civilizations around the world discovered fish sauce independently. It's often kind of a shock that although we associate fish sauce very heavily with Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam and Thailand, it was actually a staple of Roman diets for a very long time. The history of what would become fish sauce is a subject for another episode, but this is the predecessor to what we know as miso today. So as we discussed earlier, the main goal in producing Aspergillus oryzae mold on whatever substrate you choose is to take advantage of those 3 key enzymes. And the interesting thing about something like a fish sauce, which is a garum, which is a sauce that today can be and is made using koji to speed up the process, it doesn't need it in the first place because the guts of the fish themselves contain a lot of the enzymes that are necessary. So although nobody knew exactly why it worked, we did find pretty early on in a lot of different cultures that if you just cut the heads off fish, put them in a barrel with a bunch of salt in between them, they will eventually become this very delicious, umami-rich sauce. And that's why fish sauce is one of these amazing products that rides that line between practicality and enjoyability, because it can add so much richness and flavor to an otherwise bland dish, but it can also provide an incredible amount of nutrition to soldiers on the battlefield in a relatively small package, similar to the effect of bouillon on soldiers in the West. And it was this best of both worlds sort of effect, along with many other factors, made people continue to explore the world of these amazing sauces. And eventually it was discovered that the same effect could be achieved on soybeans. This would allow people to preserve one of their favorite crops and turn it into something that could affect their dishes in a way that they had never seen before. But of course, these chefs of ancient China weren't making koji in the way that we make it today. They weren't getting a nice little baggie of spores in the mail and then mixing it with some rice flour and dusting it over their rice. At least that was the case in the beginning. Eventually, ancient Chinese cooks would develop chu, which is a starter similar to koji spores that you would find today, but with a lot of other things wrapped inside. It's the mold grown on a starch and then ground into a powder. But that's a subject for another episode. It's such a diverse and vastly useful ingredient that it deserves an episode of its own. But in the beginning of these productions, they were likely using entirely natural fermentation, which means you're trying to create an environment in which the cooked beans will take on the spores of Aspergillus naturally. And you're also trying to create an environment which encourages the growth of the Aspergillus that you want, but not of bacteria and molds that you don't want. This is a process that would have required a lot of trial and error, and it's definitely a testament to how much these products were valued and how much work people were willing to do in order to apply these techniques to different foods, both for preservation and flavor. It's actually quite a mystery as to when the first soy-based ferments showed up. The first one ever, the granddaddy of what would eventually become shoyu and miso, is known as daochu. And I really wish this had a better translation, but it basically translates to soy nuggets. These little umami bombs were found in a tomb alongside the wife of a Han ruler who died in the 160s BCE. But their origins are thought to have been much earlier than that. There's a poem from the famous Chinese poet Chu Yuan that was published around the 4th century BCE called The Summoning of Spirits. And I highly encourage you all to look up this poem because it is just a beautiful description of one of these scenes of people coming home and enjoying all of the foods that they missed while they were off at war. And one of the recipes detailed in this poem supposedly uses daochu as one of its key ingredients. So although it's widely accepted that the first instance of these appearing in written record is in the 2nd century BCE, it's very likely that they existed long before that. But regardless of when they first appeared, as soon as daochu was introduced, it became incredibly popular and quickly became a staple of Chinese cooking. And it even remains so today. You can find daochu, or soy nuggets, at most Asian grocery stores, even here in the States. If you're on the West Coast and you have access to a 99 Ranch, you can find my favorite brand of these beans, the Yangjiang brand of daochu, which are salted and dehydrated and packed with ginger. And the process for making these remains relatively unchanged. You likely inoculate them with the spores of the mold intentionally, whereas before, as we discussed, it would have been done naturally by trying to encourage the mold to grow from the air on the beans. But beyond that, it seems to be pretty much the same product people would have been eating in China over 2,500 years ago. And that's pretty amazing to have an ingredient so perfect that it's still in use after that much time. It even remains one of the staples of such famous Chinese dishes as mapo tofu, one of the most popular Sichuanese dishes in the West. Part of why daochi has remained so ubiquitous for so long is its versatility. Being that they're the whole beans, you can really modify them a little bit to create rough versions of things like miso and shoyu, and back in ancient China they would have likely been used to make a jiang, as we discussed before, a paste or a sauce. A good example of one such sauce is black bean sauce, which is one of the foundational elements to many classic Chinese dishes. And that sauce is still used a lot today in dishes such as jjajangmian, which is a noodle dish made with pork and this sauce and a variety of other ingredients. And it's so ubiquitous that each region of China has its own variation, as do Korea and Japan. And the Japanese variation actually has a museum dedicated to it in northern Japan. And that's along the lines of what we'll be exploring next week as we follow the journey of Chinese jiangs, daochi, and other condiments as they make their way across Asia on the backs of Buddhist monks. But thanks for hanging out. I learned a lot by doing this episode, and I hope you learned something listening to it. If you have suggestions for future episodes, notes, or corrections, let me know. I'll have my email and Instagram in the show notes. In the meantime, read some Chinese history or mythology, talk to people about food, try something you never would have tried before, and I'll see y'all next week.